Everybody wants bigger government, more government programs, more government spending. And so if we tried that in the aftermath of, that type of economic war, we would take a horrible situation and just make it much worse.
Why is it that you think the U.S. would lose an economic war with China?
Well, I don't think we have the military, the artillery to actually fight a war with China, because China is our biggest supplier of goods and our biggest lender. I mean, sometimes it's Japan. I mean, China and Japan kind of take turns for America's biggest creditor, but certainly our trade deficit is larger with China than it is with any other nation. And so America is more dependent on goods flowing in from China than it is from any other nation. And we don't have the ability to pay for those goods. We don't export goods to China to cover the cost of those imports. We rely on the Chinese willingness to accept our dollars that we just create out of thin air. They don't cost us any money to create. I mean, we don't even have to print them anymore. So we don't have to spend the money on the paper or the ink. It's just a digital, electronic entry. So we create that, and the Chinese supply us with all sorts of goods that we don't have the factories, the infrastructure, the trained workforce to produce ourselves. So we've got the Chinese doing all this work for us. And so I think if we ever really went to war, if China basically decided, okay, we're just going to cut America off, we're not going to be shipping merchandise to the United States, nor are we going to be lending money to Americans. We're not going to buy any treasuries. We're not going to buy any mortgage-backed securities or any other dollar-denominated debt. And as a matter of fact, we're going to start selling the debt that we already hold to the extent that it matures. We're not going to roll it over, and we're just going to unload our dollars, and we're just going to buy gold instead. And I think that would create a massive pandemonium here in the United States. It would be a complete implosion. And then the question would be, how would the authorities handle that? Because the only viable solution to that catastrophe would be massive cuts in government spending, dramatic repeal of all sorts of rules and regulations, so that we could try to rebuild a legitimate economy, because the one we have right now is completely phony. It's a bubble that depends on countries like China supplying us with goods that we don't make and loaning us the money to buy them. And so if all of a sudden, we have to, become self-sufficient, that's not going to happen with our current tax and regulatory environment. You're going to have to see major reforms. But politically, that's not how the pendulum is swinging. Everybody wants bigger government, more government programs, more government spending. And so if we tried that in the aftermath of, that type of economic war, we would take a horrible situation and just make it much worse. So I recognize that you don't have a pure free market in China. I mean, not even close, but you don't have one in the United States either. I mean, our economy is pretty much centrally planned to a large degree as well. I mean, what do you call the Federal Reserve? You have a group of central planners that have been price fixing interest rates, and it's done tremendous damage to the structure of our economy. That's one of the reasons that we depend so much on the rest of the world, because we don't save enough, we don't produce enough, and we rely on countries like China to do the production and the savings for us. And I do think that the idea that, if China were to lose America as a customer, I think that's actually a plus for China, because we're not a paying customer. They have to vendor finance us. I don't think the Chinese are benefiting by exchanging goods for paper. I think that the Chinese people would be much better off if they got to consume all the stuff that they're working hard to produce. And you're correct, at current prices, they can't afford it. But you adjust the exchange rates, the dollar crashes, which it would, I think, in this type of economic situation, and the Chinese currency goes up. Well, now, of course, the Chinese can afford to produce the products. Because you're right, it's supply that creates its own demand. If you've got a situation where the Chinese have all this merchandise, that's not a problem. The problem is America with no merchandise and just a bunch of paper. Now, I agree with Brent that we have tremendous potential. We have lots of natural resources. We have lots of infrastructure. But how do we unlock that potential? I mean, right now, you talk about all these oceans. We have a huge trade deficit in fish. Why can't Americans catch fish? Why do we have to get fish from the rest of the world But you need fishermen. Somebody has to go out there and know what they're doing. You have to have the equipment. We've been eating foreign fish for so long, we forgot how to catch them. That's the problem. The longer America stays dependent on the rest of the world, the more screwed up the economy gets. And we've enjoyed this privilege of issuing the world's reserve currency for a long time. And yes, it's given us this advantage. We have a standard of living that's much higher than what we're entitled to based on our productivity. But the longer we can get away with it, the worse it's going to be when the tables are turned, because the rest of the world does not benefit from this relationship. It's not symbiotic. It's more parasitic. I mean, the world has to pay the cost to underwrite American profligacy. And the longer they let us get away with it, the more expensive it becomes. And obviously it has to end at some point. President Lincoln said you could fool some of the people all the time and all the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. I mean, eventually the world's going to wake up and this is going to come to an end. And so I think that, the war is winnable, because I think that the Chinese and other countries, they're losing right now by maintaining this relationship. And I think that's why they are currently looking for alternatives. I mean, yes, the Chinese right now, their economy does depend on a lot of things in dollars, and they don't like that. And they are trying to wean themselves away from that so they can pull the plug. And even if they stop trading with Europe, and I know they do export a lot from Europe, and they also import from Europe. They don't have the huge imbalance with Europe that they have with the United States. Because, Europe as a community has relatively balanced trade. But, they could trade with India, they could trade with all sorts of other countries that aren't in Europe or the United States. They could trade with South America. But again, they've got a huge market of people. The whole purpose of trade, the only reason you export is to import. That's basically it, because it's comparative advantage. If the Americans make something more efficiently than the Chinese, it's better for the Chinese to make something else and then trade rather than make something themselves that could be imported for an expenditure of less resources. But if you're just exporting for just to get paper money, you're not accomplishing anything. And so they don't need to export to the United States if it's not to facilitate the payment of imports, and so they'll just consume what they produce. But just imagine life in America. You go into a Walmart and the shelves are empty. We saw a little bit of that during COVID, but it could get a lot worse. Well, it's not so much a choice of the government. I mean, the people want Chinese products. How do they get them? Well, they have to export something. They export food, and they can import these products. But I agree with you. We're not likely to get to a situation where this happens by government decree. But I do think that ultimately, over time, the dollar is going to lose this reserve status, and then trade with China is going to collapse on its own, because the dollar is going to collapse and Americans aren't going to be able to afford all of these Chinese products. So the Chinese will either trade with other people who can afford to pay for their products with other products, or the Chinese people will just start consuming a lot more on their own, which is going to be great for them. They'll have higher standards of living. If the Chinese produce goods that the world wants to buy, and they say that you need to pay yuan for these goods, not dollars, to the extent that people want those products, they're going to need yuan to pay for them. I mean, that's where the demand comes from. It's the productive capacity of the nation. And if you need that currency because you need their products, well, then you need the currency. I mean, right now, the main demand for the dollar is not for our products, not that we don't have any products, but our biggest product is our debt. And so people want dollars to buy treasuries. God knows why, but that's what they do. That's what they do with them. Or they buy, other financial assets, or maybe they buy U.S. stocks.
Or they service their U.S. dollar debt. That's the biggest driver.
Yeah, although one day their U.S. dollar debt is just going to be repudiated, with inflation. So that's the least of their worries long term, because the U.S. government is the biggest U.S. dollar debtor. We got a $31.5 trillion debt, and it's unpayable. And so the only viable political way forward is to inflate that debt away. Well, when the U.S. government inflates its debt away, it inflates away everybody's debt.
How does China inflate away their 300% total debt to GDP? How do they get out from underneath that big debt burden?
Well, it's not. You're talking about all the debt. It's not
if you look at all the assets in the banking system compared to their GDP,
but you're not talking about, that's not government debt. You're talking about
no, but that's corporate debt. But isn't corporate debt important?
I'm not talking about our corporate debt. We got corporate debt. We got municipal debt. We got tons of debt. We got more debt than anybody. But obviously, look, the Chinese economy has some problems, and there's going to be defaults. There's going to be bankruptcies. I mean, the whole world's kind of screwed up because it's been on this U.S. dollar reserve system. We haven't had real money since 1971, so we got 50 years of funny money and central planning when it comes to interest rates, and so the whole world is screwed up. I'm not saying that it's paradise over there in China, but I'm just talking about, on a relative basis, which country is the most screwed up. And I would say that our economy is more screwed up because we have been the primary beneficiary of this monetary system. And so our economy has evolved with that crutch, with the crutch of not having to produce, not having to save. And so it's not going to, we're not gonna be able to turn on a light switch and reprogram everybody in America and give them the bad news that, hey, it's time to go back to work. Everybody has just been conditioned to think that, well, the Fed can fix every problem. We'll just print some money, right? I mean, everybody looks to government. Look at the State of the Union address that we just had. It's all about all this great stuff that the government's going to do. Nobody talks about capitalism or freedom. Everybody expects the government to hand them everything on a silver platter. Well, so far the government's been handing them the stuff that the Chinese have been putting on that platter. When the platter's empty, I mean, it's going to be a rude awakening.
Well, I listen, I agree with that. The whole world is in for a rude awakening.
Peter, what do you say to Brent's point about, the U.S. is a net exporter of food, net exporter of natural gas? So aren't those big advantages for us?
Yeah, look, it's a good thing that we're blessed with natural resources. Imagine if we were like Japan or something. I mean, we couldn't even survive if we were in their situation. So it's a good thing we've got those things. But I think if you actually think about it and you look at the relationship that America has with China, and you just look at what we sell them and what they sell us, and if you didn't know anything, if you were just like on another planet and you said, hey, here's these two countries, one of them grows shit and takes stuff out of the ground, raw materials, and sends it to this other country, which sends back all these manufactured finished goods and stuff like that. I mean, China would look like the real economic power. We're like, a little colony of China. I mean, we're sending them stuff that grows, and they're making all the stuff that, where you need factories. So they've got all the economic industrial might. All we got is a bunch of farmers. Not to belittle them, but that's just harvesting, what we've got from God. I mean, we don't have the industrial might that we once had, because you look at what America's exports were 50, 60, 70 years ago. We were exporting manufactured goods. That dwarfed our agriculture. That's what we were giving everybody. Automobiles, refrigerators, washer dryers, television sets, cameras, all the stuff, all the quality stuff was all made here. Nobody would buy anything made in Japan, right? It was a joke. So it just shows you how much everything has switched when you just look at the terms of trade and what we produce and sell and what we have to import.